Some footballers are legends on the pitch, but criminals off it. These are the darkest sentences in football history. Let's count them down. Quincy Promes was sentenced to 1 week after being charged with attempted manslaughter. Eric Cantona was sentenced to 14 days after allegedly assaulting a man. Ian Wright was sentenced to 32 days after failing to pay tax. Brandao was sentenced to 1 month after being convicted of violent assault. Jerome Boateng was sentenced to 2 months after assaulting his ex-girlfriend. Serge Aurier was sentenced to 2 months after assaulting a police officer. Duncan Ferguson was sentenced to 3 months after being convicted of assault. Jan Molby was sentenced to 3 months after being convicted of reckless driving. Tony Adams was sentenced to 4 months after being caught drink driving and causing a car crash. Ronaldinho was sentenced to 5 months after being caught with a forged passport. Lucas Hernandez was sentenced to 6 months after violating a restraining order. Rene Higuita was sentenced to 7 months after being involved in a kidnapping case. Fabio Cannavaro was sentenced to 10 months after being accused of tax evasion. Joey Barton was sentenced to 10 months after being convicted on violent charges. Troy Deeney was sentenced to 10 months after being convicted of violent assault. George Best was sentenced to 12 weeks after being convicted of drink driving and assaulting a police officer. Karim Benzema was sentenced to 1 year after being convicted of conspiring to blackmail a teammate. Marlon King was sentenced to 18 months after being convicted of sexual assault. Alex Kokorin was sentenced to 18 months after attacking and beating a man. Pavel Mamav was sentenced to 18 months after attacking and beating a man. Mickey Thomas was sentenced to 18 months after being convicted of money laundering. Michel Platini was held for 20 months under suspicion of corruption. Harry Maguire was sentenced to 21 months after being convicted of assault and bribery. Marcos Alonso was sentenced to 21 months after crashing his car and killing a passenger. Adam Chapman was sentenced to 30 months after being convicted of reckless driving. Ruben Semedo was sentenced to 2 years after being convicted of kidnap, wounding, and robbery. Brino was sentenced to 3.8 years after burning down his own luxury home. Dani Alves was sentenced to 4.5 years after being convicted of sexual assault. Edmundo was sentenced to 4.5 years after a fatal traffic accident. Adam Johnson was sentenced to 6 years after being convicted of grooming and sexual activity with a minor. Lee Hughes was sentenced to 6 years after being convicted of death by dangerous driving. Robinho was sentenced to 9 years after being convicted of group sexual violence. Nizotra Belsai was sentenced to 10 years after being convicted of connections to Al-Qaeda and plotting an attack. Bruno Fernandes de Souza was sentenced to 22 years after being convicted of murder, kidnap, conspiracy, and corruption. Gavin Grant was sentenced to 25 years after being convicted of murder. Omar Ortiz was sentenced to 75 years after being convicted of kidnapping and consuming illegal substances. Benjamin Mendy was sentenced to between 5 and 20 years after being convicted of rape and sexual assault. Patrick Kluivert was sentenced to 240 hours of community service after being convicted of reckless driving. Jermaine Pennant was sentenced to 90 days after being convicted of drink driving. Gylfi Searson remains under investigation for child sex offences. Mason Greenwood's case outcome remains unknown, following charges of attempted rape and sexual assault. Fame and talent mean nothing when you break the law. Like, subscribe, and comment which one shocked you the most.